All right, so we'll crack on with applications. I'm going to start talking climate change, which is, I think, one of the most popular and also one of the most controversial kind of applications of these niche modelling or species distribution modelling approaches. So let's, what I want to do is dig into a little bit into how we make these kinds of predictions with the kind of methods that we've been, working with, and give you a few examples from the literature. Dozens and dozens, hundreds of papers out there. I'm just going to focus in on a few of the better known ones to give you some examples. It's just a taster really, but then to raise some comments about some of the kind of cutting edge areas for future research. Of course, you're all kind of working on PhDs and similar, so to try and point you towards some directions that I think are particularly kind of exciting and have a lot of future in them. And as I've said, I also want to, I think this is a good case study for looking at how some of this field has actually kind of got out beyond academia in many ways and has actually become quite relevant for things like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so policy implications, quite influential in that sense, and also in just more kind of public discourse, public discussions. So here's a kind of figure that I've changed the example, but this is exactly what we've seen a few times. Okay, this is the basic structure of what we do with an ecological niche model. We know something about the distribution. This happens to be, I can't remember the species, it's an Arctic alpine plant from Europe. We know a ton about the environment, so we know about temperature and precipitation and the like. And then we're going to build some sort of ecological model. Remember, that's just a generic form. Probability of the species occurring as some function of the environmental conditions. It might be a Maxent model, a regression model, boosted regression tree, any types of models, but essentially they're correlative statistical models that associate the occurrence records with the species distributions. That's a niche model. It happens in ecological niche space or environmental space, and then we project it back into geographic space. So I've given you a number of examples, for example, like from Madagascar this morning, and there's just another example of the kind of thing that you've seen for a plant in Europe, in the UK in this specific example. So all we're then doing when we do climate change is exactly the same model building process, but instead of, say, projecting it to a different region when we talk about invasive species, or projecting it back to the same region, we're actually going to project it under a different time slice. So all we're going to do is, having built our model, so after constructing the model, characterizing the niche, we're going to throw into the model, in effect, we're going to feed into that calibrated model some future climate scenarios. So we're going to say, if we tweak the climate, where might those suitable environments be in the future? And we come up with these kinds of predictions. So this is for the present day. This particular species is, it's actually, I've got it written here, it's a twin flower. It's a subarctic woodland dwarf shrub. But this twin flower, is climatically suitable in these parts of Scotland and in Wales and some of the higher points down in the south of England. We then project it, we tweak the climate, we feed in some future climate scenarios, and we project where that suitable climate may be in the future. And in this case, we get classic things that classic patterns that we see in the observed record. Species are moving upslope as the climate warms. We see that all over the planet. And in general, it's a bit more complicated than this, but in general, things are moving poleward, right? Things are moving away from warmer areas and tracking their climatic niche and moving towards the poles. And we see that in the future predictions, exactly as you'd expect. If you change the temperature, you change the precipitation patterns, you're seeing these kinds of general patterns, upslope shifts, poleward distribution shifts. And we can characterize for a load of species using exactly the kinds of methods that we've talked about. We can make these, predictions under future climates. We can set thresholds. We would set thresholds based on the present day. So we know that, you know, we're saying, assuming that above a certain value, a certain probability, the species is present, and then we apply that in the future as well. So we can come up with these neat kinds of predictions and apply them across a lot of species. Now, I'm not going to talk much, I already have done a little bit yesterday when we talked about environmental data about the sources of climate scenarios, but there are a ton of data sets out there that you can use, but essentially the starting point is the data that comes through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You tend to be working with different climate models, as we've mentioned, so more formally atmospheric oceanic general circulation models. These are the big process-based models that predict or estimate scenarios of future climate. Different emission scenarios, so you have the different models and they're all run on a range of different emission scenarios. These are, you know, the kind of, don't really use the terms now, business as usual or policy type scenarios where, you know, how much, you know, how bad are the emissions in effect over the coming century. So they're not really predictions of what the future will be like, but more scenarios of likely pathways that we're heading down. So you simply feed those into the model, and if you're using Maxent or something, there's basically just a little box there on the software, in the software, where you can just say, you know, okay, so you've calibrated the model as usual, now where do you want me to project it to? And you project it to a future climate scenario. So fairly easy to actually, in practice, do the predictions to make the predictions. And there have been a ton of papers doing this kind of stuff, and some of them pretty high profile, you know, in journals such as Nature and Science and PNAS and that. So quite high profile science, particularly some of this stuff from the early 2000s. I think this is 2002. So this is a paper, Town Peterson and colleagues, projecting Mexican faunas under global change scenarios. I'm just going to flag it, you know, read the paper, but, you know, it's just in effect doing just exactly as we've talked about the last couple of days, feeding in the future climate scenarios and then looking across a range of species, different taxonomic groups, you know, those that are moving out of an area, those that are moving into an area, those that are losing climate space, those that are gaining climate space. Okay? Extinction risk is a real biggie, and I'm going to build on this one in a minute. This was a well-known paper. Chris Thomas and a bunch of colleagues published a paper in Nature back in 2004, which was on extinction risk from climate change. And it's, again, applying exactly these kinds of methods that we had on the previous slide, but saying that if you've got a species that has a prediction of a current climate suitability of X, you know, kilometre square, its current range, and it shrinks massively by 90% or by 80% or by 95%, then the hypothesis is that you know, the assumption is that is a species that would be at high risk of extinction. So this was a paper that over hundreds of species, over 1,000 species, did these kind of models, ran these kind of models, and then estimated extinction risk, the proportion of species that were going to potentially go extinct, that were at risk of extinction because their suitable habitat, their suitable climate space was massively shrinking. It's been done more specifically looking at plant diversity in Europe, so PNAS paper, Wilfred Tullier and colleagues. Amphibians and reptiles in Europe is another example. Linking not just looking at climate change impacts, but linking land use change impacts as well. So instead of just tweaking the variables that are to do with climate, tweaking the variables that are to do with land use as well, and looking at kind of the synergistic impacts of the two threats at the same time. So another kind of area, this is just one example of where that's been done. And then another example, just actually building on the last session that we had that was looking at reserve prioritization, which was doing exactly as the comment was made. This was Lee Hanna led this paper in Frontiers of Ecology and Environment, I think it is, that does exactly as we discussed. It doesn't just make the predictions under future climate scenarios, it then does a reserve prioritization on top of that and asks, in effect, you know, how could we conserve species best into the future? And there are a number of studies that have done that, not just looking at kind of at a particular time slice, like in the 2050s, you know, where we would be best having conservation areas, but also looking at kind of corridors that would help species to migrate to get there. So bunch of studies that in effect do this fairly straightforward conceptually in terms of the kind of stuff that we've already discussed. Build the model as usual, tweak the climate, and ask what happens to the distribution of the niches. And I'm just flagging a few papers because there's so many out there. There's a few to start with, a few kind of well-known ones from a few years ago that are a good starting point, but there's a ton out there. Probably the most famous, if you like, of all of them, got the front page of Nature back in 2004. Chris Thomas led it. He's a professor at the University of York. Feeling the heat, look, biodiversity losses due to global warming was the cover article. And what they did for about 1,100 species, I think it was, from different areas all around the planet. They had 6 or 7 study areas. Built exactly the kind of models that we've been talking about, using different algorithms, different you know, Maxent type approaches or generalized linear models, just exactly the kind of stuff that we've talked about, but did it on a much bigger scale than has been done before. Did it to over 1,100 species. And then what they did that was quite cunning was to apply the species area relationship. So remember, what I've said that we're doing here is basically, you know, assuming you had a threshold, you have a prediction of the current range of the species, and you have a prediction of the future range of the species. That future range might be bigger. You get some kind of, we often refer to winners from climate change insofar as species that are going to expand their ranges under climate change. You have to make assumptions as well, as we've already mentioned earlier in one of the earlier sessions, where you have to make assumptions about the dispersal ability of species. So often in these studies, you just have a kind of no dispersal assumption versus full dispersal. So if your current distribution is here and your future distribution's over here, then you're going to have to disperse to get from one to the other. So you have assumptions, but ultimately what you end up with is a prediction of the current range and a prediction of the future range. So what this particular study did was add the species area relationship, which is, for those of us who are kind of trained in ecology, it's pretty much the only law that we have in ecology, or one of the few kind of laws of nature that we have, that the number of species is directly related to the area. Larger areas, more species. So a larger area that you have, the more species that you would expect to see. And it's based on kind of island biogeography theory originally, but plot it on a log-log graph, it tends to come out as a straight line. We're not quite sure often what the slope of this line is, but you can make some assumptions as to what that slope is. But it says that if you have a bigger area, you're going to have more species. So what this study did, and they did it in various ways, but to give you the lowdown, is one of the ways they did it was to add up all of the areas for the present day, like the area for present day, just add it all up across 1,100 species, and then add them up under future climate scenarios. And what you end up with is a shrinkage in the total amount of area that is suitable for these organisms. And they did it by species, and they did it by adding up all the species as well. But ultimately, they quantified total area for the present day and total area under a range of future climate scenarios, and then applied this relationship to say, well, if we lose so much area, we would expect to lose a certain proportion of the species. Okay? So, kind of a neat idea. It's been widely criticised in some respects, but it's a cool idea that, you know, as the area changes, if we're expecting that the amount of area for the species is going to shrink, then we would expect that area to support less species. So their kind of headline result, if you like, this is a quote from their paper. We predict, on the basis of mid-range climate warming scenarios for 2050, a range of scenarios, of course. Remember, I talked about different scenarios in terms of emission scenarios and different climate models. But if you take kind of mid-range scenarios for 2050, we've talked about really scenarios for the 2050s. Kind of a technicality, but worth pointing out. So they were predicting that 15 to 37% of species in their sample of regions and from their sample of taxa will be what they termed committed to extinction. I think it was a very carefully thought out phrase, but basically to say, these species are on a trajectory based on this species area relationship that we would expect to see a loss of a significant proportion, 15 to 37% of species under these scenarios, come the middle of the century. Based on exactly the same methods that we've discussed, exactly the same tools that you can go away and play with and understand and get the results out of, added this twist of the species area relationship, used a bunch of future climate scenarios, did it across a bunch of species and came up with a very headline grabbing result, as we'll come back to. So when we talk about some of this work being kind of influential in the literature, if you like, but a little bit beyond that as well, of course, we all know about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Very influential body that influences government policies and public debate. So their fourth assessment report back from 2007, which was within the time frame of this paper that I've just mentioned, that and others coming out, concluded 20 to 30% of species are likely to be at increased risk of extinction if global warming exceeds 2.5 degrees, which is that kind of mid-range future climate scenario. Or, and again, the models like we've been talking about, you don't just predict for one scenario. They were trying to test across a whole range of scenarios, so they came up with some lower predictions and some higher predictions, but kind of the highest predictions under 3.5 degrees C warming, which is a more extreme warming scenario, but not outside the bounds of what the models say are possible. That extinction risk could be 40 to 70%. So that was kind of their alarming predictions in many ways, and quite influential in these policy reports. So that was the 2007 IPCC assessment report, the fourth assessment report. There's been a ton of work, and we can brainstorm at length on uncertainties in these kinds of predictions. All I've done in this particular slide is list a bunch of them that we can briefly talk through. But some of them that we've kind of already touched on. We've talked about extrapolation, model extrapolation. Of course, there's the underlying uncertainty just in those climate scenarios. How realistic are the scenarios of future climate? We tend to sometimes like to break them down just to help us understand them into those uncertainties that are really ecological or biological. They're about how we understand the biological system, versus those that are kind of algorithmic. They're more technical. They're more about how we actually how we do the modelling. So some of the ecological ones, I've mentioned dispersal capacity. Well, often in these kind of predictions, people have just said, well, we don't really know how well species are able to disperse through the landscape. There's a lot of debate, there's a lot of research, and particularly kind of long distance dispersal and how that occurs across different taxonomic groups is relatively poorly understood. So people often assume, well, let's just say, let's assume there's no dispersal, or let's just assume that species can disperse anywhere. So it adds a big uncertainty because we don't really understand the capacity of species to disperse through landscapes, particularly kind of modern fragmented landscapes where you've suddenly got golf courses, car parks, hedges, cities, towns, etc., that are influencing the dispersal capacity of species. We don't understand very well biotic interactions. Those results that I've just shown you are all individual species based, right? We're predicting what happens to an individual species. But species don't exist just on their own. Remember, go back to our BAM diagram. We talked about abiotic factors. We talked about movement. That's kind of dispersal capacity. And we talked about the biotic environment as well, the biotic niche. Species exist in communities. So if one species changes, it's going to have knock-on impacts to others and potentially very complex interactions throughout a whole ecological community or a food web. Very poorly understood. There's been some really cool research done, and that's beyond the scope of this session. I want to focus on the distribution modelling, but it's an area that the distribution modelling is modelling individual species. Putting those species in the context of a community is not what is usually done. This issue of non-analog climates is another one that we're often, it's related to extrapolation that we've talked quite a bit about. You know, we're projecting into areas that, under climates that there simply is no current analog for. Temperature regimes, precipitation regimes that don't exist at the moment. So how can we parameterize a statistical model that tells us how the species will perform under those new conditions? We're extrapolating. Rapid evolutionary adaptation is another case that things that we're, you know, there's some cool work that's being done, but is relatively poorly understood. And the distribution models that we work with just assume that a species has a niche, right? We parameterize the model, we say this is the niche of the species, let's project it into the future. Well, what happens if that niche changes? And there are good examples of species that do rapidly evolve over the course of decades, a few generations. They can actually evolve their climatic tolerances. It's not something that's taken into account in the niche modelling or the distribution modelling that we're working with. Another thing that we don't take into account is the direct impacts of CO2. This is particularly on plants, of course. Respiration, and that is affected by the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. We are just looking at impacts of climate change, so temperature and precipitation, but not actually the impacts that come with that because of, often referred to as carbon CO2 fertilization in the atmosphere, insofar as there's a lot more CO2, which is going to affect plant growth, something we just don't take into account. These are all opportunities that I'm flagging as well for cool PhDs that address some of these issues and try to move the science forward. I'm trying to give you a bit of a picture of kind of a caricature of where we're at the moment. Of course, there's really cool work being done in these areas, but these are some of the main uncertainties. Other things are things like the coarse scale of analysis that we're working with. Okay, we've talked about scale. We've talked about scale in terms of the resolution of the grid cells. But if we're working at a certain resolution, we're missing level of detail within that, and so there's a lot of good work that's showing that microclimates are really important. So actually within a 1 kilometre grid cell that we're working with, it might be actually that species are actually occupying niches at a much finer resolution. So although the larger scale climate is changing, species are managing to find homes and find suitable niches at a finer resolution. Right? They're not necessarily responding to these relatively large scale grid cells that we tend to work with. We've talked about model selection, and I've shown you a kind of worst case scenario, or at least a bad scenario, of how different models can predict differently. So how do we select a model? Do we use a consensus approach? These are all uncertainties that we need to start thinking about. As I've mentioned, just the raw uncertainty in the climate scenarios, and thresholding as well. We talked this morning a lot about thresholding. How do you set the thresholds to, if we're going to characterize, you know, the current range and then the future range, well, that is dependent on setting a threshold. And there are different ways to set thresholds, so it's introducing an element of uncertainty insofar as, you know, how we should set that threshold. So there are a bunch of uncertainties. There's a bunch of cool work that's being done to address some of these and move the science forward. There's a number of references there. I've been particularly interested in unraveling some of these uncertainties and that I'll point you towards. Of course, as usual, the references are later on in the presentation. But what I want to get across is a bunch of uncertainties, things that simply aren't taken into account in the present kind of applications of species distribution models. So just bearing that in mind, then moving to the fifth assessment report from this year. Actually, the synthesis was released just last week, I think it was. And you know, there's a section, it's really working group 2 on extinction risk and that. This is kind of the summary statement that builds on from the fourth assessment report. We've moved to a large fraction of both terrestrial and freshwater species face increased risk of extinction under projected climate changes, creating a bit of a stir, a bit of some debate, because in some ways the certainty has decreased. There's no backtracking on it's a big threat, but there's less willingness to put a percentage of species that are this idea of committed to extinction, or at least on a trajectory to extinction, in the new report. There's a bit of a step back from that, not from the main message, but from the hang on, there's so many uncertainties here, there are so many things that we don't understand, that actually putting a number on it like 20 to 30% or 40 to 70% is misleading, or is not where the science is at right now. We can't really say that. We're going to go for a large fraction. So a lot of that is, stuff that we've already talked about that you can go away and apply, and highlighting some of the uncertainties, opportunities for you folks to start addressing some of these things. A couple of the things that, there's a bias here of things that I'm particularly interested in, but kind of things that I think are hot topics for current and future research. There's a lot of work that's going into coupling niche models, ENMs or SDMs, with demographic models. And again, we've had a number of examples of understanding what the SDM, what the distribution model can tell us about. It tells us about habitat suitability or environmental suitability, and then linking that with other approaches that tell us more, that take us to closer to our answer, or give an extra level of biological realism. So this is, I think, a really cool set of approaches from the climate change literature. So here's, in effect, another way of looking at our ecological niche model, right? We take the species occurrences, we take some environmental variables, and we take a bunch of future climate scenarios. And we do exactly what we've just talked about. We build a model that predicts habitat suitability into the future. But that is just telling us about habitat suitability. It's not telling us about the ability of the species to actually disperse through the landscape and occupy those habitats. It's not telling us about the demographics in terms of what the population sizes are likely to be. So one thing that's been done is basically to interpret that habitat suitability, and there's a caveat here that there's a bit of an assumption that there is a relationship between carrying capacity and habitat suitability, but use that and link that with a classic kind of demographic modelling approach, or a population viability analysis. So here we have our predictions of changing suitabilities in the landscape, but we're actually modelling demographics on top. So we're having parameters like generation length, growth rates, dispersal abilities, fecundity. So we're actually saying that, again, on a cell-based system, we start with a set of populations, and we set the models to run, and they actually, send off propagules to disperse and populate new cells. Then populations start to grow, and they reach maturity and have offspring, and then those offspring disperse out and populate new areas. It's a much more dynamic model. It's a much more process-based approach, because we are actually modeling the ecological processes. It adds in a whole new level of biological reality, in effect. And what we ultimately do is we're modelling abundance then. We're not just modelling habitat suitability, but we're actually modelling the abundance of species within those habitats. It's more dynamic because we're doing it usually on a finer time scale. So some of the work that I've been involved in doing this, we've actually had to do a lot of work to generate future climate scenarios that aren't just, say, for the 2050s and 2080s, but actually have annual time slices, because we need to model the dynamics of this. So we have species that move gradually through the landscape. They populate new cells, they grow populations, they disperse to populate new cells, and it happens more dynamically in a kind of process mechanistic way. So ultimately we model abundance, which means we can really get at extinction risk. So instead of trying to infer extinction risk based on habitat suitability, the classic papers that I've just kind of highlighted, instead of just saying, well, the habitat shrinks, so we'll infer that therefore the extinction risk is higher, we're actually trying to model the abundance of the species within those habitats. So instead of having a proxy, some sort of estimate of extinction risk based on habitat suitability, we're actually modelling the probability that a population will reach zero, i.e. that the population will go extinct. And then you can actually model, probability that it'll reduce by 90%, or that it'll reduce by half, or whatever, but zero is the kind of extinction risk thing that we're often interested in. And here's one set of results. So I'd flag a key paper for that. There's a few. David Keith led an article in Biology Letters in 2008 that sets out this kind of methodological framework. Damien Fordham is another author who's done some really cool work in this field. But some work that I've been involved in and colleagues, we basically ran these kinds of models for a bunch of amphibians and reptiles in North America. And again came up with estimates of extinction risk. And here's just one example of the set of results. So we have extinction risk on the y-axis. That is an actual proper estimate of extinction risk. There are whole new uncertainties in there and that, but it's not a proxy based on habitat suitability. So we actually model the extinction risk, the probability of the population declining to 0. These are averages across 36 species with some error bars under three climate change scenarios. One of no change, where the probability of extinction is not 0, but is very low, and then under 2 future climate scenarios. A reference scenario is pretty much kind of business as usual, and a policy scenario is, well, let's assume that we start doing something about the emissions. It's a better case scenario, if you like. And interestingly, we come out with results that aren't totally different, frankly, to the habitat suitability-based estimates. In the extinction risk, you'll see is 20 to 30%. Interestingly, not so much difference between the two climate scenarios, which has created a little bit of discussion. One interpretation, wouldn't necessarily be my interpretation, but one interpretation is that it doesn't really matter what we do about emissions, because the biggest step is climate change is happening. Even if we bring it down a bit, it's not going to bring it down hugely. So in effect, this step here is much smaller than this step here. So it's not very. Some people have interpreted that a little bit that, well, it's not that much use then doing anything in terms of in terms of mitigating climate change. So the literature, there's often there's 2 ways to deal with climate change. You mitigate the actual threat, or you adapt to that threat. And of course, in reality, we need to be doing both. But this calls a bit more for a need to help. We need to adapt to this challenge, to this threat, rather than just being able to mitigate it. Anyway, I'm just pointing you, to the literature, to some articles that are out there to get you reading on this topic. One exciting area, I would say, is making better estimates of extinction risk by building better, more process-based, more mechanistic models with more biological reality in them, so that we can really estimate extinction risk much more accurately. Another thing that I think is a movement, if you like, or a characteristic of the literature in the last few years and where it's heading, so this should be relevant for your theses, is we're not just really interested in okay, so let's estimate how bad extinction risk is under climate change. The literature is moving a lot more away from let's just try and estimate what that proportion of species is that's at risk to, well, what information do we need to do better conservation planning? How can we actually identify species better that are at risk of extinction? Okay, so take the example of the IUCN's Red List. It's currently very difficult to incorporate climate change within the IUCN's Red List. I mean, it's not explicitly in there. The criteria for red listing species were kind of developed before climate change was seen as this major threat. So there's the push at the moment. There's an IUCN climate change specialist group. One of the tasks of which is to try and incorporate better climate change within the IUCN's Red List, so that we can actually identify species that are at risk because of climate change. But it raises a scientific question, that being, what makes a species at high risk because of climate change? What are the traits of those species that we can use to be able to actually go out, do a conservation assessment and say, this is a species that is at high risk of extinction because of climate change? Much like the IUCN criteria at the moment, are based on range size and other life history traits of species, we were saying, well, what are those life history and range change or range characteristics that make species more vulnerable to climate change? So there's a number of people that are interested in this, and I'm going to give you an example from work that I've been involved in. But we basically run a bunch of models, distribution models, coupled with population viability analyses. But instead of focusing on what actually is the extinction risk, we focused on what are the variables within the models that create high extinction risk. So we kind of did massive sensitivity analyses where we adjust the parameters of the species, adjust the parameters, take loads of different samples of parameters, run the models, and see which parameterizations create high extinction risk. And then we were able to rank them in terms of the importance for defining extinction risk. And we could say that things like occupied area was really important, population size was really important, generation length is really important. So I'm not going to go into the details of the particular results that we found, and this is quite preliminary. It's more of a trying to develop the methods so that we can get at these problems. But this is another area that I think that the literature is moving towards, and you might be very interested in, not just trying to estimate what extinction risk is, but what are the characteristics that make species at risk of extinction that can then be used actually on the ground in conservation planning, where you're not necessarily going to go out and actually run fancy complicated models that you do in a PhD, but you're doing a conservation assessment and you need to make a strategic, informed opinion based on the data that you have, which probably isn't a whole bunch of models, based on the characteristics that is this a species that's at high risk of extinction? And there's some big questions out there that I think need to be answered scientifically, and that we can use distribution models, and that's what we tried to do in this particular study, that we can use some of the modeling and the data crunching to get at that question, what are the traits that make species at risk of extinction? So here's one example to start with, just from very recently. Actually, we published a paper, it was actually out, it's to 2013, so last year, looking at Arctic greening, something I haven't really talked about in this session, but it was a little bit different to distribution modelling, but essentially it was a kind of distribution modelling approach. We weren't modelling individual species, we were modelling vegetation types. But the very short picture is that we know that the Arctic is greening. It's what you'd expect under climate change. The climate is warming, so conditions are getting more suitable for plant growth. So what's happening is that shrubs and trees and grasses are expanding across the Arctic. And we see that from remote sensing data and other data sources. So what we're interested in this particular study was to look at feedbacks to the climate system and how the vegetation is likely to progress over the coming decades. We did a very similar thing to the kind of things that we've been talking about with distribution models. We took some vegetation classes. These were derived from remote sensing. Things like graminoids, so they're the grasses, different classes of grasses, different classes of shrubs, prostrate shrubs, low-lying shrubs, erect shrubs, larger standing up shrubs, and trees. So we took these vegetation classes. We then built kind of like distribution models. They're statistical correlative approaches. We actually did it a little bit differently because it was a multi-class system. Rather than asking is the species present or absent, we asked across all these vegetation types which is more likely to occur. But fundamentally, it was a niche modelling exercise. And then we projected them. We fed in, after calibrating the model, we fed in the future climate scenarios and asked where might those different vegetation types be distributed in the future? Where might those envelopes of the species, the niches of the species be distributed, or the vegetation types, where might they be distributed in the future? And I'm showing you on this slide a kind of worst case or the largest change that we predicted. Of course, we did this across a whole bunch of different parameterizations of the models, across a whole bunch of different climate scenarios. This is the most extreme. We assumed that trees could disperse a long way. We took a kind of worst case climate change scenario, but it's a good way of illustrating. You can see visually the kind of magnitude of change. Things are getting greener. So what we see here, this is across Siberia. We did this across the whole of the Arctic. Is that the tree line's moving north, the smaller shrubs are becoming larger shrubs, areas that used to be just kind of mosses and lichens are actually becoming covered in grasses and shrubs and the like. We see this greening, we're able to quantify the amount of greening. Okay? And I'm not going to talk about the paper in more detail, but we put this out. It was published in Nature Climate Change, which is kind of one of the higher profile journals. It's part of the, it's one of the nature journals, so it got some publicity, and a press release went out with it, and we got a bit of coverage in the media. But this is one example of some of the coverage that we got. So this is our polar bear with palm trees, which is, I think, a good example of the kind of thing that I want to move on to talking about. Suddenly you put out these results, and of course the paper is stuffed full of caveats. There's a supplementary material that, pages and pages of it with different scenarios and different parameterizations and carefully worded results. But ultimately, when it gets out into the world beyond our academic journals, these things can take on a life of their own. Okay, and here's just one example of, that the article that went with it that talked about this huge changes across the Arctic. In actual fact, the reality is that it's much more subtle changes than that. Still major changes, but not quite like that. So I want to step back now. That's just one example as a taster, but to a kind of classic example, because we've just looked at this paper, right? 2004, front page of Nature, Chris Thomas and colleagues, very important, influential paper. You remember that they predicted on the basis of mid-range climate warming that scenarios for the 2050s that 15 to 37% of species in their particular sample would be committed to extinction. That's a quote from their paper. Press release that went with that, carefully worded, written by the scientists and their press officers and people involved in the study. If the projections can be extrapolated globally and to other groups of animals and plants, our analyses suggest that well over 1 million species could be threatened with extinction as a result of climate change. Okay, so this is in the press release that went with the paper. Very carefully thought out. That's what they put out there. Who remembers this coming out? Were you involved? I guess some of you weren't thinking about some of these things back then. This was a big splash for those of us who work in this field. This was suddenly, this paper got dozens and dozens of news articles all over the world, major newspapers in the UK, in the US, all over the world. It had a big influence, a lot of discussion online. Here's some examples of headlines that came out, just a sample, but classics. The Guardian here in the UK, an unnatural disaster, global warming to kill off 1 million species. Where, the science behind this now, where those results came from. San Francisco Chronicle, another classic, dire warning for Earth's species, 25% could vanish by 2050 as planet heats up. These illustrate a couple of things that were common through an awful lot of coverage. Firstly, I looked at 39 articles from around the world just to see how it was reported. This was Richard Laidler, a colleague then in Oxford, did this for the UK. I looked at a few more articles as well, particularly because I was based in the US. So building on his work, but essentially looked across a whole bunch of newspaper articles, and I found that over half of them reported that 1 million species estimate. Okay? And about 1 in 4 said that the extinctions would occur by 2050. Okay? So remember that the authors were very careful to use this, I've done my little silly quotes thing, committed to extinction. Right? Very carefully thought out phrase. It wasn't just written glibly. Because remember the species area relationship, they're on a trajectory that you would expect kind of statistically over time to lose that proportion of species. But that's a bit of a subtle argument for a newspaper headline, right? So it becomes by 2050. We're going to lose 1 million species by 2050. So where does this 1 million species come from? Okay, so it was in the press release. It wasn't in the scientific paper. How many species are there on the planet? Right, we don't know. We don't know to within pretty much the right ballpark. But 4 million would be a pretty conservative estimate, so that's pretty fair. Let's assume there were 4 million species on let's assume there are 4 million species on the planet, and their models were saying, you know, they had a huge range of extinction risk, you know, the proportion of species, but 25 was kind of mid-range, quarter of species. So a quarter of 4 million species is about 1 million species. It's that kind of back of the envelope calculation that comes up with the 1 million species. It's extrapolated from their sample of, you know, the paper was about their sample of species that were actually endemics in particular regions, but they put out this big headline number, 1 million species, in the press release, and that got picked up massively. And there's been quite a lot of debate then, you know, is that good? We got we, as the community of conservation scientists, if you like, got this, you know, our science out there into the big wide world, into the, you know, into the public sphere and influencing policy and the like. But the actual accuracy of the reporting, here's some examples of where, you know, for one reason or another, it's partly what with the spin of the scientists, it's partly just simplifications of the press. But it's quite a different take, right, to what's actually in the scientific paper. So there's some debate about this. I've picked off a couple. So Lee Hanna was a co-author of the original paper, and a colleague from Conservation International who wrote, basically the argument was that the extinction risk, the coverage is worth the inaccuracies. So the fact that the message got out there was what's important. The fact that the million species is a little bit dodgy, you know, where do we get that from? How many species are there? But it was a good catch. Without that, would it have got so much coverage? It's great for journalists, right? You know, there's a great thing for a headline and to latch onto. So it was very clever from the scientists to put that out. But they're also spinning the science beyond the actual scientific paper. They're putting out something to get attention. So one argument was that the inaccuracies were worth it because we got the message out. You know, if you think what usually fills the newspapers, be it wars, sex scandals, whatever, you know, we got a conservation message out there. And Chris Thomas, for example, has I think quite rightly said that people don't remember probably the 1 million species or the by 2050, you know, that's kind of a technicality. What people might remember is that climate change is a threat to extinction. And without some of these spins on it, then we probably wouldn't have got that message out. Okay? I'll leave it at that and move on, but hopefully you'll have some thoughts. Another important point that's related and I think important to make is that science can't tell us what's good or bad. Right? We're getting into the realms of trying to interpret the results. So here's an example from some work that I was involved in we published in 2002. It was some work that was funded by conservation organisations in the UK. We basically modelled a bunch of, it was some government funding as well, but we modelled a bunch of species across the British Isles using exactly the kinds of methods that we've talked about. It's kind of early stuff where we just, you know, assumed full dispersal versus no dispersal. Things like that, you know, not the more recent stuff with demographics and that. But we basically published a paper where we listed some species. You know, it's published Global Ecology and Biogeography. It's not the front page of Nature, but it's one of our kind of standard good academic journals. And we talked about some species were going to be losers from climate change and some species were going to be winners, and we gave some examples. And this again was, let's run our distribution models and let's say that those species that massively expand their area, they're kind of winners, and those that contract their area of suitable habitat in the future, well, they're kind of losers. So we listed these winners and losers, and we got not quite the same coverage that the Nature paper got, but we got a little bit of coverage, and here's some examples. The Daily Express, our wildlife in peril, global warming to kill rare birds and butterflies. Daily Telegraph, a warm welcome. Climate change isn't all bad news for Britain's flora and fauna. Exactly the same bit of science, exactly the same paper, not with a big press release or anything, you know, smaller scale than that, but there's two totally different interpretations or spins on the same bit of science. And our science, our models, can't tell us one's right or one's wrong. It's about values. It's about, you know, what your interpretation of the results are. So we have to be careful when we're running the models and doing the science, how we present it. Are we adding our own values in terms of, well, this is all bad or this is all good? How do we objectively present the results without adding our own values to it that can potentially kind of, you know, taint the science, if you like? So again, just another example from distribution modelling, getting out into the wider world and different interpretations of the same bit of science. Another key point I want to make, the risks of making gloomy predictions, if you like, and I'm going to relate this back specifically to the distribution modelling, but I'm going to pick on this chap, John Holdren, who's a very senior, very well-respected, brilliant scientist, chief scientific advisor to President Obama. Very, very senior professor, very well-respected scientist, took on a political appointment. Okay, so again, we're thinking about moving beyond academia into broader issues. His Senate hearing in the US, that you have to be appointed to one of these political positions, you know, you have to go through the grill, if you like, in terms of getting a good grilling and ultimately hope for approval from the Senate that you will be appointed to that position. He got massively picked on from a statement that he made back in 1986. He said that global warming could cause the deaths of 1 billion people by 2020. Okay, that was a kind of headline that got out there and been associated with him. He got a really hard time in his hearing. He did get approval, he got through, but from some of the politicians for scaremongering, basically. Are you really a good scientist doing objective science, or are you into scaremongering? Are you putting out these kind of predictions that are crazy and never going to come true? Are you just making overly gloomy, catastrophic predictions? There's an obviously parallel there, you know, the 1 billion people by 2020 compared to our 1 million species by 2050. You see the link? So, you know, again, there's been a lot of debate that claims of kind of impending catastrophe can only actually maintain credibility, and we're in the business of doing science that needs to maintain credibility, otherwise the science becomes a political tool. If we need to maintain the credibility, then you can only maintain that credibility if that catastrophe actually occurs, or if at least some particular policy or intervention or action is seen to avert it. But if it just, you know, doesn't come true, then you're open to, you know, if 1 million species haven't gone extinct by 2050, what happens to our credibility as distribution modelers or, more broadly, biodiversity scientists? And to take that one step further, catastrophist messages can actually, or might be, counterproductive. Now, let's not read too much into this, but who's seen The Day After Tomorrow? It's a silly Hollywood blockbuster. It's kind of, I enjoyed it. I'm not supposed to admit that, but I thought it was really good fun. Okay, scientifically, it's a bit crazy, but it's about, you know, it's this crazy, it's actually global cooling, but a big kind of climate change, you know, scenario. It's really got a silly love story and the like associated with it. But there was an interesting study that was done in Germany about the perception of the probability of climate change, where they interviewed people before they saw the movie, silly Hollywood blockbuster about, you know, climate change, versus after they saw the movie. And the general feeling was climate change, you know, is quite probable. But the interesting thing is that the conviction, or those that were saying that it was very probable, actually it flipped, it reduced to rather probable after seeing the movie. So the kind of crazy catastrophist message, let's not read too much into it, but could be counterproductive. It actually makes people think, well, you know, this is all overblown. 1 million species by 2050, you know, don't quite believe it. And it can actually, the argument is made, turn people off and reduce the credibility and the action that might be taken. I'm just going to throw that out there as something to discuss. So here's some things that I'd like to open up for your opinions. How can biodiversity scientists, or more specifically for us, species distribution modelers or ecological niche modelers, how can we best communicate our work? You're all doing this kind of work. A lot of you doing climate change projections, but you know, it doesn't need to be climate change. It's still doing this kind of science. Can we be advocates without damaging credibility? How do we maintain our credibility in the science without being open to the accusation that we're just pushing forward an agenda or some values that we have? Is getting coverage worth the risk of inaccuracies? Better to just get some coverage. Are we really interested in getting coverage, or are the inaccuracies in that not worth it? And how can uncertainty and the possibility of catastrophe, because remember this is all about probabilities and that's a possibility that's out there, but how can these kinds of uncertainties be communicated in a soundbite? And you probably already have, but if you're working in this field, you may well end up picking up the phone to journalists and being interviewed and things like that. And how, you know, they're after sound bites. They're after the 1 million species by 2050 sound bite. How can you best communicate the complexities that we've talked about over the last couple of days accurately whilst maintaining the credibility and talking about the uncertainties, but keeping the interest? It's a big challenge, and all I'll do is throw that out there and make sure you're aware of it. But let's have a discussion. But just to finish off, I'll just flag, as usual, bunch of papers there, quite a few here. I'll take the liberty of flagging. I've been particularly interested in the whole climate change field and wrote a book a couple of years ago on that. And a lot of these issues that I've talked about, beyond distribution modelling, there's distribution modelling in there, but these general issues about how we can communicate biodiversity science more broadly are written up in this book. So if you're interested, that would be another starting point to take a look.